Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
The Heart Mountain Interpretive Center between Cody and Powell does an excellent job of preserving sites and artifacts and documenting experiences of those who were confined here during World War II.
This is the site where my grandmother's family was held during World War II on the basis of their race.
The legacy of the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center through a present-day lens with Northwest College instructor Aura Newlin. Next on Wyoming Chronicle.
Funding for this program was provided in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.
Hi, my name is Aura Newlin. I am a fourth-generation Japanese American. I'm also a fourth-generation Wyomingite, and I am also a faculty member at Northwest College in Powell. I teach anthropology and sociology. Today we are at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, halfway between Cody and Powell. It is the original historic site of the Heart Mountain Relocation Camp, as it was called, where approximately 14,000 at its peak Japanese immigrants and their American-born children were held against their will during World War II on the basis of their race. And this is the site where my grandmother's family was held during World War II on the basis of their race. My relatives came from Japan to Wyoming in the early 1900s. They settled here, they raised their families here. They were laundry workers, they were coal miners, they were railroaders in this great state of Wyoming. And on one side of my family, my grandmother's side of the family, after spending their lifetimes in Wyoming, 30 years approximately, their family moved to Hollywood, California, and then, in a twist of irony, were sent back to Wyoming following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. There were about 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, or persons of Japanese ancestry, who were affected by this evacuation order. It is a little bit odd for someone to be a fourth-generation Japanese American and a fourth-generation Wyomingite, because most of the time when we think of Japanese Americans in Wyoming, we think of people who were originally in California and were sent here to Heart Mountain, Wyoming against their will because of their Japanese ancestry. And then most of them left after the war years as well. My relatives came from Japan straight to Wyoming on both sides of my family. So on my grandmother's side of the family, her parents came from Japan to Wyoming in the early 1900s. My great-grandfather was a railroader for the Union Pacific Railroad, and my grandma used to say that all of us kids, 7 of them in total, were born all up and down the railroad between Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Ogden, Utah. My great-grandfather was a section foreman on the railroad, so he took care of the tracks between one stop and the next. And so while he and his wife were Japanese immigrants, their children were American-born citizens, and they had a good life in Wyoming. They loved it here. He spent his whole career here, and after 30 years on the railroad, he retired and moved the family to Hollywood, California. And on the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Hollywood Boulevard, he set up a grocery store that he actually named the Wyoming Grocery because they loved Wyoming so much. That was their home in this country. And so he poured all of the family savings into the Wyoming Grocery in Hollywood, California. And just when they were starting to get settled in their new life, Pearl Harbor was bombed. And as my grandmother says, another kind of bomb fell on the Japanese Americans who lived on the West Coast. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that authorized the forced removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from an exclusion zone that blanketed the west coast of the United States. They were removed from their homes and sent to a total of 10 camps throughout the United States. And so, as irony would have it, my relatives, who were originally in Wyoming, got taken from their home in Hollywood, their new home in Hollywood, and sent back to Wyoming of all places, and were confined at Heart Mountain here on this site. That's my grandmother's side of the family. My grandfather's side of the family, they also came straight from Japan to Wyoming in the early 1900s. My great-grandfather himself worked in the laundry business. He ran the Green River laundry and dry cleaning business. And like on the other side of the family, his children were born in Wyoming. So they were all American-born citizens and Wyomingites from the start. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, my grandfather was then old enough to be working, and he himself was working on the Union Pacific Railroad. Because his family was in Wyoming and not on the coast, they were not subject to Executive Order 9066. So they were not forced to leave their homes. However, quite apart from government action, the Union Pacific Railroad as an industry, as a corporation, made the decision to fire all of its Japanese American employees. So my grandfather, along with the other workers, were laid off of their jobs. And for them, that meant that they also lost their housing, because most of the railroaders lived in railroad housing. So although they were not forced away from their homes in the way that my grandmother's family was, they suffered greatly. My grandfather's family actually had their own place because they had businesses outside of the railroad, but they ended up housing other Japanese American families who had nowhere to go when they were booted out of their homes in February in Wyoming. I have an amazing letter, a draft of a letter, I suppose, that my grandfather wrote to the president of the Union Pacific Railroad following the firing of all of the Japanese American employees. And it's eloquently written. It has a really powerful tone to it in its lack of antagonism, I suppose. And he strongly but gently argues that it was wrong to fire everybody just on the basis of their ancestry. Many of us were born in this country. We've never known any other life. We love America. We love Wyoming, and we love our jobs on the Union Pacific Railroad. We have worked hard for you, and none of us are perfect. But, you know, we didn't deserve to be laid off as a whole. And he sent this letter to the president of the Union Pacific and never got a response back. But the FBI did come knocking to his door soon thereafterwards in Green River, Wyoming, or maybe Rock Springs, Wyoming, because this letter must have triggered something in the FBI, and they came and investigated him for being a possible security threat, which of course he wasn't. So that's my grandfather's side of the story. And there are a lot of other stories that wind in and out, but that is my connection both to the Japanese American experience during World War II and my connection to this state. I myself was born and raised in Riverton. I feel a very deep connection to this state and a very strong pride for Wyoming. I love Wyoming, and I'm so happy to be back here working. My career is here, and it's made all the more meaningful now to have this museum on site that I'm able to be a part of as well. I'm secretary of the board of directors of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation that started building this museum, and we had its grand opening in 2011. And here we are in 2017, a truly world-class museum on the site. So when visitors enter our museum, we have them start in this area, which depicts the pre-war lives of Japanese immigrants. And like I'd mentioned, most of the stories that are depicted here are of folks who are on the West Coast. My family story is atypical in that my family history is rooted in Wyoming. But as you can see, there was a thriving community, and one of the important things to note is that anti-Japanese and anti-Asian sentiment had begun long before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We often think of Pearl Harbor as the impetus for race-based discrimination against persons of Japanese ancestry, but in reality, there had been both day-to-day discrimination and institutionalized discrimination against the Asian community in California long before that. This is the entryway to the museum itself. When you first enter, you see this post with the sign that was posted all over communities along the West Coast, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, and it told them where they were to go to register and to report in response to the orders that followed the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And although this is not my family's grocery store, this is a grocery store that looks very much like theirs. And I actually have a picture of the Wyoming grocery with the sign, with a car very much like that in front of it. And this would have been a typical scene in the wake of Pearl Harbor in California. So we encourage people to look at these pre-war years, and then we have this theater space where we show an introductory film that gives some of the background to the camp experience. And beyond getting the introduction to the film, you go into the museum and you experience the rest of that through here. So in this room, we have displays that help you gain a sense of what life was like in the immediate wake of Pearl Harbor. While people were still in California, they were told to pack only what they could carry. And so you had to make decisions about whether you're going to take clothing or whether you're going to take family photos and musical instruments or your baseball bat. You have to make decisions based on what you can carry when you're going to a place you don't know where you're going and you don't know how long you'll be there. So there was a lot of fear and consternation among the Japanese American community at that point. And as you can see some of the headlines of the time, there was a lot of war hysteria that fed into this mass removal based on race, including by people as beloved to us now as Dr. Seuss. This gives an indication of how widespread this war hysteria was at the time. And in hindsight, it's been acknowledged by the US government that it was in fact racism and war hysteria that prompted the mass removal. There was in fact no national security threat posed by Japanese Americans at the time. So my relatives who ended up at Heart Mountain, they were actually on the first train to arrive at Heart Mountain. This would have been the location of my relative's barrack in Block 1, Barrack 1B, Unit B, I suppose. And what's interesting about being able to see on the diorama, rather than just looking at the address listing in the register, is that on the diorama here, you can see that their barrack was right next to the exterior fence of the camp, which was a barbed wire fence. And it was also right next to the guard tower. And at least in the beginning years of camp, at the beginning, these guard towers were staffed by armed guards with their guns pointed inward. So I can only imagine how that must have felt for my relatives to have their imprisonment so present to them every time they left their barrack. they would see immediately that they were, in fact, not free. Barbed wire, guard tower, gun pointing in at them as a constant reminder of their lack of freedom in this place. They were on the first train to arrive. They were also on the last train to leave. So they were here for the entirety of the camp years. I mentioned military service. My great uncle Clarence, of course, served in the military. He was drafted. My grandfather George, who was fired from the railroad, he also served in the military. He volunteered as soon as Japanese Americans were granted eligibility to serve. That was his way of showing that he was in fact a patriotic American. That was his way of showing loyalty to the United States. And so he, along with many others, volunteered to serve. My uncle was drafted. My great uncle was drafted, and he willingly went. But there was also, a lot of division within the Japanese American community about this question of whether or not to serve in the military while they were being subject to what they felt to be an unconstitutional act, and what has since been recognized as an unconstitutional act. What started off as a loyalty questionnaire to determine whether or not someone could be trusted to serve in the US military, there was a questionnaire that was given out that eventually was given to all incarcerees here as a petition for leave clearance. And these two questions became a lightning rod for a lot of the frustrations that had built up during camp. Question 27, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And question 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor? These two questions are poorly written and difficult to answer in the best of situations. People were looking at this first question and said, well, if I answer yes, that I'm willing to serve in the armed forces, does that then mean that I'm volunteering to serve? I don't want to volunteer. But if I answer no, will that tag me as disloyal? So this was an impossible question to answer. Question 28. For the older generation, my great-grandparents' generation, they were not allowed to become US citizens by law. There was no route to citizenship for them. So if they were to swear allegiance to the United States and forswear allegiance to Japan, give up their allegiance to Japan, even though they wanted to become US citizens, this question in effect was asking them to become stateless. They wanted to be US citizens, but the US wouldn't take them, and so they were not so sure they wanted to give up allegiance to anywhere. So for the older generation, this was an impossible question to answer. For the younger generation, if they answered that they would forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor, that sort of indicated that they ever had allegiance to the Japanese emperor. These are kids who are as American as apple pie. They've never known anything other than the United States. A lot of times they outright rejected any cultural connection to Japan, just like a lot of teenagers and youth would do now. They were American through and through, and so this was a catch-22 for them, because of course they were committed to the United States, but they had never been committed to the Japanese emperor, and so this would in effect be asking them to admit that they had been. Most people ended up answering yes, yes to these questions. One of my great uncles answered no, no. And as a result of that, he was tagged as a traitor and a threat, and he was segregated to a camp called Tule Lake, which was in California, which was designated as a segregation center after this questionnaire was rolled out, and that's where the bad guys were sent along with their families. And so this ripped the Japanese American community apart. It ripped families apart, and only now are we beginning to recognize that those who answered no, no were just as brave and courageous and patriotic as those who served in the military. And my family has pieces of all of those dynamics in it.
And Aura Newlin, it's wonderful that you're joining us here today on Wyoming Chronicle. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've given us a wonderful tour of the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. This is something that is fiercely important to you. But I want to ask you about what people understand coming to you as an instructor at Northwest College. You teach about Heart Mountain and what happens here, or what has happened here. What do your students wonder? What do they not understand when they first come? Do they know anything really about Heart Mountain often?
It's interesting. I usually poll my students at the beginning of class before we talk about Heart Mountain and what happened here. And it seems like I get a mix. There's certainly always a handful of students who say, oh yeah, I feel like I've spent my whole life learning about this. I went out to the museum in high school, or my elementary school history teacher taught us about this. I did Wyoming History Day maybe. I've learned a lot about this history, a handful of students. Most of the students say, well, I know that there's something out there, but I don't know very much about it. And I always have a few students, sometimes local students even, and sometimes students from other states who say, I had no idea that this even happened. I get a mix, and for my local students especially, it seems to come down to who they had for high school history, or who they had for middle school social studies, as to whether or not they'd been exposed to this history.
And as you travel around Wyoming, I think maybe you could expand that, not just to students, but to Wyomingites in general.
Absolutely. I think beyond the Big Horn Basin, people have a sense that, yeah, I remember hearing about that at some point, but largely people are unaware of the details, unaware of the broader context, and certainly nationally, I'm speaking to groups around the country increasingly, and a lot of people, even who consider themselves highly educated and history buffs even, come out alarmed saying, I had no idea. I wasn't aware.
In some of your writings, you've written that in a sense, sometimes it's perceived that this is swept under the carpet, that this facility does a great job of preserving the relics and the records, but really not much more than that in most people's eyes, and that it is brushed away. Why is that?
I think it's a shameful part of our country's history. It's a shameful part of our state's history, and it's kind of a natural human response to focus on the good and forget about the darker sides of our history. The position of this museum, and my own position, is that we need to shine a light on history, both the good sides of it and the bad sides of it, so that we can learn from that. And I know it sounds cliche, but we can, we don't want this to happen again to another group of people. And so for me, the work of the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation and the work of this museum and my work teaching and presenting to audiences around the country is less about preserving this history and less about, it is about honoring my family's experience. And I think that my grandparents would be very proud to know that their story is being shared. And that means a lot to me. But for me, it's more about using this history to share with the public so that the Japanese American community can be a voice for other disenfranchised minority groups now who might not have such a powerful voice, who might not have the benefit of a historical lens that helps us as a Japanese American community to say, look, we did this 75 years ago and it was clearly wrong. And everybody recognizes that this was wrong on the whole. But it's harder to come to the present and recognize that we similarly shouldn't be too quick to target other minority groups who look like the enemy, just because we are in a state of war or a state of heightened fear. We shouldn't have done it in the 1940s, and hopefully we can keep those lessons alive as we move forward.
So how would you hope then that Wyoming better embraces the legacy then here at Heart Mountain?
For me, as someone who is, straddling both worlds, I'm, like I said, a Japanese American, but also a through and through Wyomingite. I see a lot of common ground between the two communities. I think this experience is often thought of as a part of Japanese American history. It's a history that belongs to the Japanese American community. And so for the non-Japanese American community, they say, well, that's not my history. That's not something that's as relevant to me. But as a Wyomingite, as my family history demonstrates, this is very much a Wyoming story too. Wyoming was a part of this camp. There are interactions that were important between Japanese American residents, like on my grandfather's side, and residents of the camp, prisoners at the camp. They did have an impact on the Bighorn Basin and on the rest of the state. And I think that I would like to see Wyomingites embrace this as part of Wyoming history, not just part of Japanese American history, but something that is our collective history here in Wyoming. And there are a lot of ways where the two communities might actually have more things in common than they have that separate them. Common themes, for instance, agriculture was one of the huge triumphs of the community at Heart Mountain. The incarcerees came to a place that was barren, and they revitalized agriculture at the camp, and it was one of the huge success stories of the camp years. They ended up providing enough produce and meat for not just the 10,000 people who were housed here at any one point, but they also, worked on the farms in the surrounding areas where a lot of the young men were off serving in the war, and so the Japanese Americans who were at Heart Mountain helped keep the Bighorn Basin alive agriculturally. So we have this connection, in Wyoming we are ranchers and farmers, and so were the Japanese Americans. As part of Japanese American culture, there is a very strong work ethic, very strong values of, respecting your elders, and strong values of education. And I think that all of those are also things that I, as a Wyomingite, would say, these are Wyoming values too. We care a lot about working hard. As Wyomingites, we have a deep connection to place, and I feel that myself as a Wyomingite. And the Japanese American community also has a deep connection to this place.
Well, I would certainly encourage everyone to visit. It's open year-round. It's a wonderful, maybe too well-kept secret that's available here for those of us in Wyoming. Aura Newlin, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for helping share this story.
For joining us here on Wyoming Chronicle.
Thank you.